Well, good evening, children. This is Larry. I'm the athletic director at Marietta College. Maybe you guys have been on campus and run around on our blue turf or in our big gymnasium at the DBRC, but now it's time for bed, and I'm going to read you a little story. Today we're going to meet Mr. Jeremy Fisher. Mr. Fisher is a frog, and he's a friend of Peter Rabbit from the Beatrix Potter stories from back in the 1920s, and Mr. Fisher is going to go fishing. So once upon a time, there was a frog called Mr. Jeremy Fisher. He lived in a little damp house amongst the buttercups at the edge of a pond. The water was all slippy sloppy and in the larder in the back passage, and he was allowed to get his feet wet because no one ever scolded him, and he never caught cold. Frogs never catch cold, you know. He was quite pleased when he looked out and saw large drops of rain splashing in the pond. Frogs like rain. "I will get some worms, and I will go fishing, and I will catch a dish of minnows for my dinner," said Mr. Jeremy Fisher. "And if I catch more than 5 fish, I will invite my friends, Mr. Ptolemy Tortoise and Mr. Isaac Newton. The alderman, however, he never eats fish. He only eats salad." Mr. Jeremy put on his Macintosh jacket and a pair of shiny galoshes. He took his rod and his basket and set off with enormous hops to get to the place where he keeps his boat. The boat was a round and green and very much like the other lily leaves. It was tied up to a water plant in the middle of the pond. I think it was a lily. Mr. Jeremy took a reed pole and pushed the boat out into the open water. "I know a good place for minnows," said Mr. Jeremy. Mr. Jeremy stuck his pole into the mud and fastened it to the boat. He then settled himself cross-legged and arranged his fishing tackle and he was sitting in his dearest little red float. His rod was a tough stalk of grass, his line was a fine long white horsehair, and he tied a little wiggling worm to it at the end. The rain trickled down his back for almost an hour as he stared at the float waiting for it to sink. "This is getting tiresome. I think I should like some lunch," said Mr. Jeremy. He pushed back amongst the water plants, and he took some lunch out of his basket. "I will eat a sandwich, and I will wait until the rain is over," said Mr. Jeremy. A great big water beetle came up underneath the lily leaf and tweaked the toe of one of his galoshes. Mr. Jeremy crossed his legs up shorter, out of reach, and went on eating his sandwich. Once or twice, something moved about with a rustle and a splash amongst the bushes at the side of the pond. "I hope that's not a rat. I think I had better get away from here." Mr. Jeremy shoved the boat out a little ways and dropped in some more bait. There was a bite almost directly, and the float gave a tremendous bobbit. It means it sank down in the water. A minnow! A minnow! I've caught a minnow by the nose," said Mr. Jeremy, jerking up his rod. But what a horrible surprise. Instead of a smooth minnow, Mr. Jeremy landed Jack Sharp, the stickleback, covered in spines. Stickleback's a big fish. The stickleback floundered about the boat, prickling and snapping until he was quite out of breath, and then he jumped back in the water. And a shoal of other little fishes put their heads out, and they laughed at Mr. Jeremy. And while Mr. Jeremy sat disconsolately on the edge of his boat, sucking his sore fingers and peering down into the water, a much worse thing happened. A really frightful thing it would have been if Mr. Jeremy had not been wearing his Macintosh jacket. A great big enormous trout came up, ker-plop, with a big splash, and it seized Mr. Jeremy with a snap. "Ow, ow, ow!" And it turned and dived down to the bottom of the pond. I think the fish was trying to eat the frog. But the trout was so displeased with the taste of the Macintosh jacket that in less than half a minute it spat it out again, and the only thing it swallowed was Mr. Jeremy's galoshes. Whew, close call. Mr. Jeremy bounced back up to the surface of the water like a cork and the bubbles in a soda water bottle, and he swam with all his might back to the edge of the pond. He scrambled out of the first bank he came to and hopped up home across the meadow with his Macintosh all in tatters. "What a mercy that was not a pike," said Mr. Jeremy. I guess pikes are worse than trouts. "I would have lost my rod and basket, but it doesn't matter much, for I am sure I should never have dared go fishing again. He put some sticking plaster on his fingers, and his friends both came to dinner, but he could not offer them fish because he didn't catch any. But he had something else in his pantry. Sir Isaac Newton wore his black gold waistcoat, and Mr. Ptolemy Tortoise had brought a salad with him, and instead of a nice dish of minnows, they had roasted grasshoppers with ladybird sauce, which frogs consider a beautiful treat, and I think, given the conditions, that must have been tasty.